Hello everybody and welcome to our summary episode for Season 1 of Painting a Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures. Over the course of this episode, we're going to go through the process of painting 4 miniatures from the A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game. These miniatures are going to be Brendan the Blackfish, Gregor Maege Mormont, and Brienne of Tarth, all from the Hand of the King box that you might have gotten if you pre-ordered it on Kickstarter. Of course, these techniques will be just as applicable to any other miniatures from this box, and probably miniatures from other games as well. All of the materials I use are pictured on screen now, and the full list of materials will be in the description. All of the footage for this video has been covered in real time in previous episodes on my channel, and links to those episodes will be in the upper right on that little button that's circular with an eye on it. Those will pop up at the start of every time we start using footage from one of those episodes, so if you want to be linked back to watch something in real time and just follow along how I did a specific part of a miniature, feel free to hit that link and go back to take a look at it. The first thing we're going to be doing with these miniatures is washing them off. A lot of miniatures, whether they're plastic or metal, when they come from the factory, might have residue from mold release or other products that were used to help in their manufacture. Washing this off will ensure that our primer and paints, or inks, will get much better traction on the miniature. To do this, you're just going to want 2 bowls of water and a toothbrush, whatever old, muzzy toothbrush you don't actually use for your teeth, as well as some cheap, budget brand dish soap. Putting that dish soap into one of the bowls of water, we keep the other one clear. That clear water is going to be used for rinsing off the miniatures after we wash them. Soaping up the water is just a process for me of stirring it up and then taking a look at the bristles of my brush to see if bubbles are starting to collect in them. Add or remove soap as necessary to get the dilution that you want. We're not trying to cover them in lather here, we're just trying to get a solution that's going to get into all of the areas and make sure we get all the chemicals off. Go ahead with your toothbrush, being careful for bits like Gregor's sword here, so that you don't snap, bend, or damage anything. Especially plastic miniatures like this, when exposed to warm water, may well bend. If you have one that came bent in the mail, for example, many of my Dark Souls miniatures had bent swords and spears and such when I first got them, you can take this opportunity to use the warm water and the malleability of the plastic that it affords to bend them back into a shape more like what you want. On big miniatures with a lot of smooth surfaces like this one, Brendan Blackfish, you're going to want to make sure that you've cleaned those thoroughly. Those smooth surfaces are going to have a hard time gripping the paint to begin with, so if there are any chemicals impeding that as well, you're going to have a hard time. Go ahead and rinse them all off quickly, just giving them a little bit of a soak and using the toothbrush if necessary to get any last bubbles out, and then set them out to dry. If you want to and you intend to paint them quickly thereafter, you can give them a bit of a muzzle with a paper towel like I'm doing here. Just watch out that you don't damage any of the sticky outy bits. The next thing we're going to be doing is priming them using an airbrush. My airbrush is a Badger Patriot 105 and an air compressor that I bought on sale at my local art store. As I just indicated, we're going to use the sticky tack to make sure our miniatures, these light plastics that they are, don't go flying while we airbrush them. The other materials we'll want are Vallejo surface primer or your preferred surface primer, and a bullet-tipped paintbrush for poking away any bubbles or pools that we end up forming. I've got a little box to elevate them up to a comfortable level for airbrushing, and of course a respirator. Primer, after all, is a chemical compound meant to layer on top of things and help paint stick to it, not something you want in your lungs. Set up your miniatures by finding a good location on the bottom of their bases to put the sticky tack on, and then press fit them down on top of whatever it is you're using to elevate them. You'll want your miniatures slightly elevated because the hopper on a gravity-fed airbrush, like this Badger Patriot 105, means that if the paint is not settling downwards and being fed by gravity, as the name implies, onto the needle, it's going to stop spraying. Therefore, you don't want something too low or too high that'll make you incline the airbrush and flow all of that paint away from where it needs to go. Before actually airbrushing your miniatures, spray the airbrush at a safe location other than the miniatures themselves. This will allow any soap, dust, or anything that could have collected in the airbrush between uses to spray out somewhere safe and allow you to make sure that you're getting the flow you want. When actually applying the primer, I prefer to dust it from a reasonable distance away from the miniature. If you get the airbrush too close, you'll get a very thick concentration of primer on one location, which will then pool and obscure details on the miniatures themselves. If you, like me, want to take advantage of the details on the miniatures, which we'll be doing over the course of this tutorial by applying ink washes, you'll want that detail to keep showing throughout the process. As such, you'll want to apply only a thin coat of primer at this stage. If it does start to pool, you can use your bullet-tipped paintbrushes, which are now dry and clean, to wick away any pools that form. Fortunately, in this case, I did not have that issue. If we take a look a little closer here, you can see that the color change is almost instant on the brown and red miniatures, but less so on these pale blue ones. Look really closely and make sure that when you applied primer such that it has covered every surface you're looking at, you move on to the next one to avoid those pools. The last thing you're going to want to do is pick them up and take a look on all sides for any undercuts or areas that might have been missed from the application of the primer by airbrush earlier. Get into those areas by applying a little more primer, but again, make sure you don't put on too much. If you do, wick it away quickly so you don't have any issues later down the line. Gregor in particular has undercuts underneath his sword and elbows which needed some tender love and care afterwards. When you've finished, put a little bit of soapy water into the airbrush and run it through. Make sure none of that primer sticks to the inside. Primer, after all, as I mentioned before, is meant to help paint adhere to things, and so if you start getting primer built up inside your airbrush, it's definitely going to be sticking around. By this point, you'll have your miniatures looking fine in a base coat of light gray from that primer. Before you go putting any color on the miniatures, you're going to want to take a look at some reference material. These miniatures from the A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game fortunately came with an art book and a lot of beautifully drawn art, which we can use as a reference for our colors ahead of time. Planning ahead will help you plan your steps and apply the same color across multiple miniatures all at the same time, speeding up the process quite a bit. It'll also make sure you get something that actually looks good coming out the other side. The first thing we're going to be doing, though, is grabbing our cheap white acrylic paint to do a little bit of a dry brush and just highlight the raised edges on these miniatures. Depending on the darkness of the primer that you've applied, in this case the Vallejo light gray is not very dark, the effect of this will be more or less noticeable. In this case, of course, because the difference in value between the light gray primer and the white paint isn't that huge, it's not going to be a massive difference. It will, however, help those raised edges push through the washes that we're applying at later stages in this process. There are lots of different methods for base coating and priming your miniatures. These can include what some people call zenithal highlighting, which is to say, taking a darker base coat and then highlighting it from above with a second lighter base coat in order to give some shading, or even base coating your entire miniature with a primer that is a color that you're going to see across much of the miniature, especially seen in military miniature making, where you can just apply sort of an olive drab across the whole miniature and cover most of the uniform all at once. All of these have their pros and cons, and in fact, azimuthal highlighting, or zenithal highlighting, is an excellent technique for combining with these kind of ink washes because it does a lot more of the shading and gives you a lot more contrast underneath of the wash before you even start going in with any color. However, since this tutorial is oriented for people who are just picking up miniature painting, perhaps having bought their first game at the local board game store, online, or off Kickstarter, I'm trying to stick to a relatively small number of materials, and therefore, I've stuck with just one color of primer. Future episodes may cover some slightly more complicated techniques, so watch out for that. Before you go on to putting any color on, make sure you plan out where you want your colors to be. For example, we're going to want blue on Brienne's skirts, red on the barding of the Blackfish's horse, green on Ms. Mormont's tabard, and yellow on any cloth bits on Gregor. Very specifically with him, you're going to want to look into the little details because he's got bits of sleeves sticking out, and you don't want to miss those. Planning out all of the areas that are one color and visualizing it before you start a step will save you from wasting paint and time by laying down your paints onto your palette, doing one spot, moving away and letting it dry and coming back later and realizing, no, I really should have done his sleeves. So try and pick them up and look at them from all angles, compare them to your reference material, whatever that may be, and see all of the areas that you may have to do in one color or another before you get started. In this case, those little areas under the armpits and shoulders on his sleeves, I very nearly missed the first time. With this first application of color, you can just go in with undiluted ink, block in the areas that you know need to be of a certain color, and just go across all of the miniatures. As you block these in, you're going to start getting a much better idea of how the miniature is going to look when it's finished, and also you'll notice that the inks are starting to pool in recesses and flow away from raised surfaces. This is going to give you a really rudimentary highlighting and shading that we're going to be accentuating by adding more coats of this ink on top of each other as we go along. That rudimentary highlighting and shading is what I consider to be the biggest perk of using ink washes over a light primer, versus what I've kind of seen recommended more often for beginners as the black primer with normal acrylics. While a black undercoat will mean that any areas you miss aren't as noticeable because they don't pop out, the acrylics going over top, and you will need to use acrylics and not washes in order to make sure that they actually lay on over top of black, end up looking kind of flat. And if you end up trying to make shadow out of the areas that you've missed, they just look like black shadow, which is also flat. By using colored ink washes over this light primer, our shaded areas end up being the same color as the material that is being shaded. In my opinion, this makes miniatures that are done this way much more vibrant and even to a certain extent more realistic than miniatures that would be done in an equal amount of time using only layers of flat acrylic. That being said, of course, there are definitely techniques to use acrylics to make miniatures look much better even than this, and I strongly recommend you take a browse around YouTube and find some of those. However, I recommend you stick with these techniques for a quick and easy but also very good looking result in the end. I've made the transition from largely acrylic painting to ink washes like this over a few years of miniature painting in my free time after work, and I have found that it gives me the best result for the small chunks of time that I'm able to give it. Now that our miniatures have gotten their primary colors and some black, some brown, etc., we're going to be moving on to blocking in all of the metallic areas. The metallic areas we're going to block in with black ink mixed with that Vallejo silver acrylic paint. This mixture is going to make all of our metallic areas have an undercoat that is still slightly silvery, but darker, significantly darker than we want our metals to be in the end. After we've varnished them, we're going to be giving it a dry brush, and that's what's going to make the edges really shine. And also, at the same time, give a bit of a beaten metal look, because it's not just a flat surface of silver. Other ways to do your metallic areas might include doing them in a straight silver paint and then applying a dark wash over top to get a much more clean, but slightly shaded in the recesses look for your metal. I like this technique, and I'm still sort of working on making it look exactly how I want, but I find that it gives a really good, beaten, irregular, silvered look by the end. The reason we put on our actual silver dry brush after we varnish the miniatures, as we'll see later, is we're going to be using a matte varnish. That matte varnish will steal away all of the glossiness of anything underneath it, up to and including silver paint, making silver paint just look gray. For a little more of a discussion on that, feel free to tune in to the full-time episodes that we have on this channel. As we go through, we try to pick out all of the little details that we might want to be silver later on. And since we have some black ink on our palette, we're going to take that chance to darken in the Blackfish's horse. We're also going to darken in the leather areas by applying more brown ink, and apply a very, very thin black ink over the paler areas of the Blackfish's clothing and hair, shading in the recesses. After that, to give Ms. Mormont's cloak a little more detail and a little more visual interest, we're going to apply our Vallejo cork brown very lightly over the surface as a sort of heavy dry brush, and then we're going to wash it down with some diluted black ink to blend it in with the rest. That same Vallejo cork brown can be used now to go over all of the bases of our miniatures, giving a sandy undertone that will wash down later in order to get an earthy look for those bases. That Vallejo cork brown is pretty thin, so it goes on very smoothly with pretty much any brush you fish up. The next thing we're going to do is apply all of our primary colors to the colored areas on our miniatures once again, but slightly darkened to give a little more edge to the shadow. I recommend darkening those colors with a little bit of blue rather than black to give a little more richness to the colors. For a discussion on color theory, again, take a look at the full-length series where I ramble on about it a little longer. By this point, our miniatures are looking nearly done, although they've got a little bit of a gloss overtone. Don't worry about that, we'll be dealing with that shortly. The next thing we're going to do is put in eyes on our miniatures, be very careful with this part, and then detail the faces. I detail the faces by taking a mix of skin tone that I do out of yellow, red, white, and brown, and painting effectively a T across the forehead and bridge of the nose, then dotting in the ridges of the cheeks and the chin, thereby sort of implying a face rather than going in and trying to really paint it. If you want to keep going at this, you can blend it in with 2 or even 3 skin tones on top of each other of increasing lightness, which makes a very good looking effect. I'll highlight that process in a later tutorial. While you have your skin tone on the palette, you'll want to go in and paint in any other flesh areas, such as the fingers of those wearing demi-gauntlets, such as Brienne. After that's dried, take a little bit of black ink and paint in pupils and eyebrows for your characters. Applying this black ink lightly gives you an opportunity to box back in any white overspill you may have left if you're a little bit shaky-handed like I am. It'll also give your characters quite a lot of personality. When you put the pupils in, try to put them slightly looking to one side or the other. If you try to make them both looking forward, any imperfections you do in their alignment will make your character look visibly cross-eyed. This may be humorous, but it isn't too intimidating. Put a little bit of pink on the mouths to highlight those, and then dry brush in any white areas that you want to pop a little more, such as the Blackfish's cloak or hair. Next, we're going to grab some texture gel. This is typical painter's texture gel, once again picked up on sale at my local art store. Any texture gel for putting on canvas should work for this, or even sand mixed with PVA glue. Apply it to the bases, then cover with some Vallejo cork brown, like we used before, and wash it in with some brown ink. This will bring it down to a nice earthy tone underneath our character's feet. Next is flocking. Put some PVA glue down, and then dab on whatever your favorite static grass is. This will give nice grassy tufts around their feet that should stand on end without the need for any fancy static grass applicators or weird technology like that you may have seen on YouTube. Dabbing it down means that the ends enter the PVA first, and therefore they'll be held standing up, at least to some extent, and I found it gives a pretty good effect. Next up, we'll break out our airbrush again, or if you don't have an airbrush, a hand brush, and apply a matte varnish across the entire miniature. Once again, looking out for any pooling. Pooling of varnish will make our miniatures look a little cloudy and purplish, at least with this brand, the Liquitex, so try to avoid it. Finally, our finishing touch is to dry brush on our silver paint. The miniatures should now be looking quite good with the matte varnish applied, and this is a good opportunity to touch up any glossy areas you want, and of course, to make the metallic areas really shine. Dry brushing it on will leave the crevices still looking dark with that darkish silver we applied before. You don't miss areas like greaves down in the grass, or rivets and belt buckles on your miniatures. Those little details shining will really make it pop. Next up, get some cheap glossy black acrylic and go around the edges of your miniatures' bases. This will really help them stand out from the terrain and make them look much more finished as an end product. If you want, you can go ahead and make that band around the bases different colored, identify different themes, or have some fun with it and write down the characters' names or put some little art around the edges. Once that's done, you're left with 4 miniatures ready for the gaming table. By now, I hope you're looking at them and you think they look great, because I certainly did as well. If you've got some miniatures that you've done up using these techniques, send me some pictures either on Instagram or on Facebook at the pages with my name, Jacques of All Games, linked below in the description. If you got any questions or any tips for your fellow viewers, throw them down in the comments. I take a look at all of them and I'd love to help answer any questions you do have. Keep an eye out for future episodes on this channel, and thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Until next time, go play some games.